everybody, it's time for Performance Anxiety. I'm Lisa Anderson, and I'll be hosting this episode along with my co-host, Joan Elizabeth. Today, you're going to be hearing from Chris Bodor, who is a guest from out of town in the St. Augustine, Florida area. Unfortunately, during this recording, we had some visual technical errors, but to our surprise, the audio was quite good. So we decided to post this episode up without the video and just let you listen to it. It's a really great episode about a poetry fest coming up in St. Augustine, which is happening on April 14th, 15th, and 16th. So we hope you'll take a listen and maybe possibly head to St. Augustine yourself. So enjoy this episode of Performance Anxiety. So welcome everybody to Performance Anxiety. Woohoo! And today we are going to be having Chris Bodor join us. And I probably butchered that a little bit. He did tell me how to say it nicely. And, it's just how I am.
That's okay, though.
Yeah, Bodor. And anyway, this guy contacted Joan and I after watching our Sally B. Dash episode, and because he's putting together a bit of a poetry fest. Now, we seem to be having some connection issues with him back and forth a little bit, and you may actually hear some thunder happening in the back. He's got some serious thunder going on. So, Chris, welcome.
Thank you so much. It's great to be connected with you, and thanks for allowing me to appear on the show.
But yes, so tell me a little bit about how you got started in the poetry world.
Okay. Well, it was about 30 years ago. So I've been doing this for 3 decades now. I can actually tell you that one of my first poems was about looking at a newspaper headline and finding out that Kurt Cobain had passed away. So I've just dated myself. 1, you might say, well, what's a newspaper? And then 2, man, Kurt Cobain died a long, long time ago. Yeah. I was riding a train to work, and I had a need to fill up the time. It was 3 hours round trip from upstate New York to New York City. And I was all excited. I was working at a film school, so employees got to take classes free of charge. So I signed up for a screenwriting class, and I was going to write great movies, and people would make great films out of the scripts that I had written. Well, I didn't really latch on to the concept. It seemed like too much of a formula. And in my notebook, I was writing these angry 20-something poems, from the mindset of me, a 20-something age young adult. And 1 year went by, and I realized in my notebook that instead of a well-formed screenplay, I had about 60 poems. So at that point, I realized that I must be a poet because I'm writing poems. And around the same time, my 2 brothers younger than me, they found out what I was doing, and they had a cyber cafe, like a coffee and computer setup in the early 90s, and they had a problem with their open mic poetry host. So they said, hey, can you help us out and bring your manuscript and see if anyone else shows up? And I was doing it every other Thursday in the evening. I would stay in the city at their apartment, crash on the couch, and then go to work in New York City the next morning, just, walk right to work instead of having a ride that didn't take that long train ride. So that's how it all happened 30 years ago. And fast forward, my family and I moved to St. Augustine, and there's a thriving open mic culture here in St. Augustine. So someone just passed me the baton.
Wow, that's
Very
amazing.
cool.
So how did you start putting together this fest that you're going to be having that's coming up in April?
COVID was going on, and we were in this situation where instead of gathering on the last Sunday of every month at a coffee shop, we migrated to Zoom, and I would get the information out. Here's the Zoom link. Click it on, and just like how we would hand out a sign-up sheet at the coffee shop or wherever we might be, I would send out emails and say who wants to be on the list, and then I would send them the secret link, and everyone else would go to Facebook Live. Like the audience would go to Facebook Live to hear 15 poets read their poetry on Zoom. And so that was going on during COVID, but I was still taking meetings and having coffee with people in downtown St. Augustine, like open outside coffee shop and 6 feet away and all that. And Christina Parrish Stone became the executive director of the Cultural Council here in St. Johns County. And we were doing a meetup. She had just assumed that duty. And she came from the Jacksonville, Duval area. And she said at the end of the get-together, Chris, what can the St. John's Cultural Council do for the Ancient City Poets? And I went right to the chase. I was like, every April we celebrate National Poetry Month. We have a special reading. A lot of people find out about it because it's under that banner of National Poetry Month all over the United States. And I said, help us out just to get the word out. And Christina said, even with COVID, find an event each weekend in April and hijack it, so to speak. Like if it's a farmer's market, ask for a table and set up a poetry table, and we could have an activity that you do that's poetry related. You can hand out flyers or what have you. And so I got involved with like a film series. They were showing films, so I curated one of those weekends was all about performers doing their poetry, like Henry Rollins footage and Jello Biafra doing spoken word and my own video performances. So that was the screening for that. And then Farmers Market we got involved with. And then that culminated with our last Sunday of the month outdoor reading. It was like a big deal. We were going to be outside for the first time since COVID. And so we did an outdoor event. And then as soon as that was over, like as soon as National Poetry Month was over that year, I started saying, I want to do a poetry festival. I want to do a fest for poets for next April. And so that's what we did last year. We had our inaugural Poet Fest, and it was amazing, just free, open to the public. Flagler College gave us the rooms to meet in, and I had symposiums and workshops and then an open mic outside that anyone could bring stuff to. And then we had like a keynote speaker at the end. So that's how that all came about. There's like a void in St. Augustine for literary festivals. And so I'm trying to fill that void as we get further and further out of COVID. Yeah.
Oh, that's really cool.
That's awesome.
So now going into our second annual, because once you do it another time, it becomes annual. So I'm calling it the second annual Poet Fest. I gave out the same invitation as last year. Come and vacation in St. Augustine and enjoy everything that St. Augustine has to offer, and drop by the festival and get on mic.
Okay.
So that's how I had to sell it, because I don't have the opportunity to pay people to come out and like professional poets. So the response has been incredible. Johnny McIntyre, she's the poet laureate of Lucas County. She was the first one to say, I booked 2 nights at the Doubletree in St. Augustine, and I'm going to show up wherever you want me. And then John Burroughs. John Burroughs is the U.S. Beat Poet Laureate. He's going to be coming out as well. For a keynote, I have Joe Kidd. His distinction is the Michigan Beat Poet Laureate. So him, he performs with Sheila Burke, and they said they're driving 20 hours from Michigan to get to St. Augustine, and they found a hotel room also, and so that's how we're doing it this year. It's like Kerouac getting on the road. All these poets are getting on the road and coming to St. Augustine, and I'm setting up the audiovisual equipment for them to share their words. Yeah, thank you.
Oh,
fantastic.
That is really cool.
Yeah.
And it's a good time to get out of St. Augustine, because by the time they get back, get out of Michigan to St. Augustine, by the time they get back, it should be, spring weather. So they'll get a little warm.
Perfect.
Yeah. But no, that's really cool.
So Chris, I just wanted to ask briefly, because you mentioned that you were going to school for, I think, screenwriting. If I'm incorrect about that, let me know. But had you been interested in poetry before that?
So I had an aversion to poetry. I didn't have any interest in it. I remember in high school, we had
so many of us, right?
Yeah.
In high school, they said, let's listen to The Sound of Silence by Simon and Garfunkel. Let's listen to The End by Jim Morrison, and 20th Century Fox by Jim Morrison too. And let's look at it as poetry. What are they trying to say? So that was actually the only time that I enjoyed the poetry discussions of middle school or high school, where the teacher was smart enough to bring it to something that I could relate to. So I have always seen lyrics as poetry.
Absolutely.
But I really had no interest in poetry until, I would say, when the movie Barfly came out, it starred Mickey Rourke as this guy who worked at a post office, and he wrote poetry at night. But it was basically a screenplay that the poet Charles Bukowski had written for.
I was going to ask if there was any connection to Bukowski.
Yeah. So Barfly is basically Babette Schroeder was the director, and he got Mickey Rourke to play the Bukowski character, and they said to Hank, write like a bunch of different short stories type of things, but he had to crank out the screenplay, and they made a movie out of it. But it was commissioned basically, and so it's not like the story of his life. It's just something that he wrote the screenplay to.
Right. I'm gonna have to check that one out.
Yeah. So that's like the springboard or the gateway drug to becoming a poet, where I was like, wait, anyone can be a poet? Because, anyone can work in a factory and then at lunch break huddle up in the break room and write a poem. But wait a minute, I can't think of words to rhyme. Oh, that's okay. Charles Bukowski just wrote what he was feeling at the time and then embellished it or added some craft to it. But he didn't get stuck in the Spoon, Moon, June formatting. That was what was so such a turnoff to me when I was exposed to poetry, because they gave all this structure, and I was like, wait a minute, I want to say something, but I don't know how to fit it into this structure, so I'm not going to excel and do it with any passion.
I definitely agree with that, because when I was in high school, my girlfriends and we used to write a lot of poetry. And of course, you have that teenage angst and and depression that makes writing that kind of stuff a little bit easier.
Yeah.
But I never saw us as necessarily poets because it didn't fit into the English box
Mhm.
that we were being taught in class. And, but we used to do things like we would write a word and then pass it to our friend, and then they would read it, and then they would write a word, and then we'd pass it back and forth
I
like
love that.
And we came up with some pretty cool stuff, if I remember right, from my teenage self.
In Duval County, there's a really thriving scene, and one of the open mic hosts started doing cringe-worthy night. I think that's the theme of their open mic. So you bring the stuff from your high school notebooks and you read it, 20 years later. And the drinks flow at the whatever
stuff you should have burned.
And then it turns into
I love that.
A bit of comedy too. Yeah. And in New Jersey, there's a guy who's doing an open mic in in like a bar that it's called Punchlines and Poetry. So he'll have a stand-up comedian do a routine at the open mic, and then a poet, and then alternate. So it is possible in one event to have humorous poetry, humorous monologues, just like celebrating all spoken words in any form.
I love that you bring that up, Chris, because there was a period of time when I was living in the Tampa Bay area, and I was actually starting to write some poetry just because I don't know, I was just feeling it. And so I actually started frequenting an open mic at a bar in St. Pete, and I read a poem one time, and it got a lot of laughs. And I was not expecting that, but it's probably because I had done stand up before that. So my humor just naturally, and after that, every poem that I wrote got laughs. And I was like, well, there's just something. And I didn't take offense to it. I was actually happy about it because I was like, clearly my sense of humor is bleeding into my poetry.
Yes. Well, and I imagine your delivery too.
Yeah, I'm sure. Yeah, I'm sure that was a lot of it.
Yeah.
But I love that you bring that up because I think the two, there's a space for the two to coexist. Absolutely.
So like just going back to my origins of how on earth did a guy who was working at a film school taken free screenwriting classes as an employee turn into a poet? Well, I wrote in isolation my first year going back and forth on the train. I was only humoring myself. I was just writing these fun little 30-line poems of how I was feeling. And then, like, I saw the newspaper headline about Kurt Cobain, and so I wrote a very marketable poem because everyone was focused on his death. So I actually got it published because people wanted to have a Cobain poem to publish. And but again, in that isolation, I then typed up at my work break. The job I was working, you didn't need a computer, but my administrator, my manager, had a computer, like a Macintosh back in the day. So during my lunch break, I would punch out, use their computer, and format the manuscript, and then I had it published, self-published, but I could have just thrown it on a copy machine if I wanted. But that was my first year of writing, my first book. And from there, that's where my brothers said to me, oh, come and bring your book and host the poetry reading and invite other people to come up. But again, writing in that vacuum, I then transformed into someone who had a built-in audience every 2 weeks. So my writing radically changed because I was like, wait a minute, if I say that word that I've written down and pronounce it the way I always pronounce it, I'm going to sound like a buffoon. I have to write words that I can say and pronounce properly. Because you have these thoughts in your head, you're writing them down on paper, they look pretty good, you give it to someone, they don't read it out loud, and they say, oh yeah, I understand what you're saying. But man, when you take it and give it an audio side, it totally changes. And, that's, I literally changed what I was writing by beta testing it, by saying it out loud, because that was new to me.
Wow.
Yeah.
I knew how to have a conversation and I knew how to write poetry, but I had to become a spoken word artist. And a spoken word artist speaks words.
Yes. And there is a definite rhythm I have picked up on from spoken word artists. And I think that rhythm really plays in how the emotions go for that particular piece as well. Would you agree with that, Chris?
Yeah, and I think we might just want to talk about the elephant in the room, which is slam poetry. That is a entity unto its own, where there's competitions about how people can say words that make them, I don't participate better than someone else, and therefore they win the competition. And I have no interest in that. Participate in those kind of things. I don't see that as a way to celebrate the art of poetry writing. I acknowledge slam poetry, and slam artists have a place in venues and so forth, but I can't relate to it. I'm here to tell my story, or in the early years, I was telling other people's stories because I didn't have that much juicy stuff to write about. It was, I work at a film school, and then I ride the train home, and I take care of my kids, and my wife cooks me dinner, and then I wasn't like a rock star, like Kurt Cobain and I were the same age when he passed away, but that's where the comparison begins and ends. I lived a very subdued life, so I would hear people talking about things next to me, like my fellow passengers, and I would write, I called it like every man. Like I write in the voice of every man. So every person has relationship issues. Every person works a job, so to speak. Every person has bills to pay. So I would write poetry that anyone could relate to because it was universal. And I got my universal material from the people I was sharing the train ride with.
Well, that's really cool. I like how you would take other people's stories from sitting on a train. That, to me, it just seems like it should be a scene in a movie, where somebody's sitting on the train and you're watching them learn how to develop their skill and taking life from other people's conversations. I think that's kind of cool.
Yeah, that's really, it's very interesting. I'm interested to know your thoughts even further on. You talked about spoken word as a performance art, and what would you say that it is reading poetry or speaking poetry, or is it different? Is it a different art form? Is there something that really differentiates it? Is it, I guess the poetry element comes into play with spoken word, but is it always poetry? Is, I guess, what I'm trying to ask from your point of view.
Okay, so Poet Fest is a celebration of creative writing and reciting. And the reason why I chose that moniker is there was a local theater group in town who said, geez, can I be a part of Poet Fest? But do I have to read a poem? And I was like, no, pick a play, perform it, and then end the 50-minute symposium by talking about the craft of writing. What is it? What is writing a play and presenting it? How is that different than writing a poem or writing a short story? So I got that covered. And then the storytelling phenomenon that's going on across the United States, I give them an hour spotlight also. So last year they just did some storytelling, and it was like for the younger age. I wanted something that even children could enjoy at Poet Fest. So at 9 a.m, we started off with an hour of storytelling geared towards children. This year, I wanted to give storytelling more of a spotlight by talking about storytelling. So that's going to be a part of it. So there's that aspect. So you have those three writing elements: poetry, storytelling, playwriting. That's all being brought up to the microphone at Poet Fest. When you look at, what your question was pinpointing is when a poet comes up to the microphone with nothing written down, takes a deep breath, and recites, that's celebrated in the same open mic event as the person who just wrote something down on a napkin, stumbled up to the microphone, looked down the whole time, reading and shaking, but saying something amazing and powerful. It's all in the same open mic. And I do that because we're celebrating creative writing and reciting. So in that form, in that open mic that I host on the last Sunday of every month for 14 years now, I can say I've seen it all. And I don't think I would have a spoken word career, so to speak, if I couldn't get away with reading what the poems that I had handwritten or typed up. Finally, like 6 years after doing this, someone challenged me to memorize one of my poems. And it took a long, long time. I mean, I had to just keep on reciting it while I was at work and when no one was around, so they wouldn't think, well, people might have thought I was talking to myself, though, because, I was really getting into it and trying to learn this 30-line poem that I had written. And but now that I have that one memorized poem in my repertoire, I can add so much to the written words. I can pause dramatically. I can talk quickly. I don't have that crutch of relying on what's written down. And so I have tremendous respect. I stand in awe of people who can get up to a microphone and just say their spoken words. So I don't criticize them. I encourage them. I need to see more of that. We all need to see more of that. But what I always want to have a open forum for the person who thinks that they can't read their poem because they've never done it before. Yes, you can. This is how you learn. This is how I learned 30 years ago when I was shaking at the microphone. So yes, there's a difference. I mean, you can use props when you've memorized it. You can't do that when you have that crutch of your words on a cell phone or written down on a piece of paper. You can't add any like real theater or theatrical aspects to it. But man, when you have the piece memorized, you could be like David Bowie there doing, amazing things, talking into a telephone as though it was a microphone, and boom.
Yeah, and to speak to that too, there's this misconception, and I know this from doing stand up too. A lot of people think that just because it's your own writing that it's going to be easier for you to memorize. And
Not true.
not so,
true.
not so at all. So yeah, I think it's wonderful that you're encouraging people to come up there with their stuff written down, I mean, so what? It's a great way to practice it.
I memorized my cell phone number so far, and my
Me
wedding
too.
anniversary.
Barely.
I got that memorized, and well, my wife's cell
You
phone
better
number.
have that one memorized.
Yeah, I have it written down in my wallet on a piece of paper. So if I ever lose my phone, I could still call her. And my social security number.
Look, I you know what? I totally relate with that, because here's the thing. The things that you repeat the most are the things that you're going to remember, right? So I remember like my childhood phone number, my childhood address and stuff, but I can't remember addresses from, where I lived 10 years ago. You know how they, like on security questions, sometimes when they're trying to verify you with your background, and like, which of these addresses look familiar? And I'm like, I don't know. Did I live at any of these places?
Yeah.
And I just recently, I think within the last year of my 12-year relationship, just memorized his cell phone number and only because we use it as like a rewards card number somewhere.
I was going to say an emergency contact. Like.
Yeah, so I think memorization is a lot harder, especially if you don't practice it on a regular.
Yeah, so yeah, it takes practice, and I do. I think it's wonderful that you open it up to that. There's no gatekeeping about that. You're not like you must be off book.
Yeah. I love that too,
because there's a lot of richness in the content, and just being able to the experience of getting in front of an audience and saying your stuff.
Yes, and that could actually be, like you said, like that person that's so nervous that all they do is look down and shake and hold their thing. But as you said, it took you 6 years before you memorized something, but it's those little doorways that you can step through that builds that confidence to be able to do something like that, and to get that response from the audience to encourage you to keep going.
That's wonderful.
Yeah, that's really cool. So, Chris, tell us a little bit more about the event, because this podcast is going to go up just a couple of weeks probably before your event starts. So we want to make sure that everybody knows about it.
Jimmy Broccoli, that's not his real name. It's his stage name. But the dude works at a library.
It's a great name.
Well, he also has a friend, Kelly Celery. So I believe they're two co-workers.
I was going to make a totally smart-ass remark, and you beat me to the punch with that.
So they're co-workers at a library job, a public library somewhere in Georgia. And Jimmy's got a bunch of books that he wants everyone to know about. And so I'm giving him a half an hour, and it's going to be a out-of-state spotlighting Georgia with Jimmy Broccoli. And so we have, it's about 7 or 8 poets outside of Florida who are traveling to perform at Poet Fest. And then we have a 6-hour open mic for anyone who wants to share their words. We have the panel discussions. I'm doing a working man spotlight, or working man and woman spotlight. So it's people who have a day job and write poetry in between the day job and have published their poetry. So I got 4 people telling about their experience of how to fit that in. And one guy now, John Burroughs, who I said is the United States Beat Poet Laureate, he now does poetry full time and tours around. And has had many jobs throughout his life that he was working just to pay the bills. And kind of like what I was saying about what I found attractive in Charles Bukowski. You work at a post office, you punch out, and then you get out your notebook and you write down whatever is ruminating in your head or heavy on your heart. You write it out, and you just name it and claim it, so to speak. And so I want to celebrate those 4 writers to show people that anyone can write words if they want to, if they're passionate about it. It's something they can do in between during their lunch break or during a coffee break or after they've done their 8 hours for the day. And so we have that a symposium going on. And here's one of the coolest things. In Duval County, they have a zine festival. It's the Duval County Comic and Zine Fest, DCAZ. Well, they're going to do a mini festival at Poet Fest. So it's not going to be as large as their usual festival, but if there's like 20 people who have their own zines and they want a table, you can come to Poet Fest and learn about how you can take your written words, put them on a piece of paper, run it through a copy machine, fold it in half, and take a book staple and put 2 staples in it, and all of a sudden you have a published zine of your story. So I think that's an important part of this whole poetry thing. And like Henry Rollins, I have Henry Rollins' first book, and it's like all handwritten. There's postcards that he sent to himself, like his home address. Whenever he was on tour, he would send a postcard to himself, and he photocopied pictures of those postcards, and that's like the first book he put out. And Henry Rollins is a good example because he has his own publishing company. And any of the self-publishers out there, it's perfectly legitimate to take like your Christmas tip money and use it to put out 100 copies of your own book so you can have something to give away or sell at your next poetry reading.
Yeah, that's really cool. That's really awesome.
Yeah.
I'll definitely be it.
So cool. So when is the festival?
April 14th, 15th, and 16th. Saturday the 15th is the big wing ding from 8 in the morning till 9 at night. But we do a kickoff the night before at the Relampago Coffee Lab across the street from Flagler College. That's the location of the English department's open mic that they do once a month. So they're dedicating the April one to National Poetry Month and a Poet Fest kickoff. But that's pretty much Poet Fest, and I'm calling it Poet Fest Day because this year we have Poet Fest Night. And Poet Fest at Night is Richard Lepre has booked bands into Sarbez that are heavy on words. So we have some rap artists who don't often get booked in St. Augustine, but now they're under this Poet Fest umbrella, a celebration of the words you say over the microphone. We have some folk artists. There's some amazing writing in folk music, and Dave Dondero he loves St. Augustine. He plays St. Augustine like almost every 6 months. I've published his lyrics as poems. He's very gracious in that respect, and he is going to be performing at Poet Fest at Night at Sarbez on Sunday. So we have that dynamic. We got a zine festival, a Poet Fest, and Poet Fest at Night. Pretty much a real bang-up celebration of National Poetry Month right in the middle of the month.
Yeah, that looks like it should be a lot of fun. Well, great. Well, Joan, do you have any further questions?
Just about I don't know if you are on social media, Chris, at all, and if you want us to share those, and also if you have a website or anything that you'd like for us to plug here.
Yeah, we'll definitely have the description of the Poetry Fest and dates and all that kind of stuff for everybody. But yeah, anything social media or
personal
website
of yours? Do you have books out there? I know you said you're published. But anything that you'd like to share with us here?
You just type Chris Bodor into Google, or maybe Chris Bodor Poet. It's Ancient City Poets. That's what I've been doing for the last 14 years. On the last Sunday of every month, we call ourselves the Ancient City Poets. You guys, if you read a poem during Poet Fest, you'll become members of the Ancient City Poets, because we only have 2 requirements. Put your name on the sign-up sheet at an Ancient City Poets reading, and 2, share something at the microphone. You can't just write your name on the sign-up sheet and run off. You got to actually come to the podium. So once you do those very
actually step up.
2 very difficult things, then you become a member of the Ancient City Poets. And then again, just go to Google and you'll be able to find everything about Poet Fest, as well as any sort of poetry things going on here in St. Johns County.
Okay, well, perfect.
Wonderful.
Well, thank you so much, Chris.
Yes,
and
thank you.
We look forward to seeing and hearing more about the Poet Fest, and maybe having you back on next year as well to talk about it. So look forward to that very much. So thank you for joining us here today.
Thank you so much for your time, Chris.
Everybody, we'll see you next time here on the Performance AnxieTEA. AnxieTEA.